Okay. Questions before we get started? No questions. You all diligently studied everything we went over, and you mastered all the material, and you knew everything there is to know now, and so you have no questions left. Okay, well, let's go back into the class and see if I can give you a few questions. We're studying the Bible, how we got it, and why we can trust it. We made it to part 2, which is reliability of the Bible. And remember, we went through the textual evidence to see that the texts that we have, the books that we have, are solid, and that we have no issues there. We looked at the translations and understand some of the issues about translations and see that we can really trust the translation. So when we're reading a good modern translation, we can be assured that for all practical purposes, we're reading what the prophets and the apostles wrote down. But that's just what they wrote. What's to say what they wrote isn't wrong? So now we're looking at reliability, and the second step of that is the external evidence. How does this, what they wrote, correspond to the world around us? And we talked a little bit about beginning this last week, but a large part of this is how you approach the issue. We're going to start first with the issue of archaeology. And when we start looking at archaeology in the Bible, and again, we're not going to go into a huge amount of depth, but we're going to touch on a couple of things to sort of frame the issue. Because it's really kind of a classic question, is the glass half empty or half full? And when we come to archaeology in the Bible, it's really pretty much the same thing. There's lots of evidence out there that supports the Bible, but does it actually prove the Bible? No. Proof is a very abstract, strange concept. So we need to start looking at how we frame this question. How do we approach the question of, does archaeology support the Bible? And one of the big problems we come up right off the bat is when you read your history books, what do you read about in history? You read about wars, you read about rulers, right? You read about great schisms and conflicts and huge movements that shaped the civilization, major scientific discoveries, things like this, right? When we read the Bible, what are we reading about? Our relationship to God. And one of the big things we come across is what is of tremendous importance to history is often not really all that important to God. Does God really care about kingdoms and wars? I mean, he cares in a sense, but is that what his real focus on?
They come and go.
They come and go. They're just sort of the backdrop against which we live out our lives. What God is really concerned about is he's concerned with the individual. He's concerned with you. He's concerned with me. Even though we're not likely to be read about in 100 or 200 or 1,000 years. No offense, but none of us are probably going to make the history books. So while historians probably won't care about us, God really does. And so what you see as major importance to God is a passing footnote at best when it comes to historians. And one of the key differences is Christianity has become a major force, but Christianity doesn't really become a significant topic of study until 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, when it became a bigger movement, when it actually began to influence the Roman Empire. So when we start looking for history, right, we look at who is Jesus Christ. He's God incarnate. He is God who came in flesh, who died for our sins, and was resurrected. And through him we have eternal life. But from a historian writing in the first century, towards the end of the first century, it's just one of them Jewish prophets. They come up from time to time and they go away, and he was killed by Pontius Pilate. We don't have to worry about him any longer. Except his followers tend to be growing for some strange reason. And that's a loose paraphrase of some of the earliest historical accounts from him. What's of major importance to God is just not that important. The birth of Jesus, just another poor baby born into the world. It happens every day. And so, would we expect to find some of this stuff? Probably not. If you think about the life and impact of Jesus, right? How many have heard of a man named Ben Kokhba? Blink and plug here, I'm going to read from my book. Page 139 of my book, which, while his name may not be familiar to most people, Ben Kokhba had a very large impact on the Jewish nation. In AD 132, Ben Kokhba began and led the final Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire. The revolt lasted for 3 years. During that time, he ruled Israel and was proclaimed by many Jews to be the Messiah. Little parallels here. The revolt was finally put down and he was beheaded, but only after 500,000 Jews had been killed and nearly 1,000 villages completely destroyed. Both Jesus' ministry and Ben Kokhba revolt lasted for 3 years. Both proclaimed to be the Messiah. Both were killed by the Romans. At his death, Jesus had only a small group of followers, while Ben Kokhba had a support of probably over 1 million people. Despite of this, Ben Kokhba disappeared into historical obscurity. So much so that until 1951, we did not even know his name. And of course, Jesus went on to a little bit more notoriety. But think about the significance of someone who led the final Jewish revolt, had over 1 million followers, 500,000 people were killed in the revolt, thousands of villages were destroyed. Kind of significant, right? Did you read about that in your history textbooks? You know what? It was probably there as the line such to the effect that, the final revolt occurred in 132 and the Jews were kicked out of Israel. So, compare that now to the life of Jesus. If you were, say at 134, right after the revolt, and say, okay, I'm picking winners and losers here. Who's going to have the most notoriety in 100 years? Ben Kokhba or Jesus? Well, it's an easy pick, right? Except what's important to us and what's important to God are two different things. So when we begin to look at archaeology in the Bible, that's something to keep in mind, is when we say, well, there's no evidence of this ever happening. Would we expect evidence of it? Would it be reasonable to expect that there would be evidence of it? And then once we begin to ask those questions, we can put these things into perspective, and it helps us understand what's really going on a lot better.
Sort of like what you said about the bill of sale for when Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites.
Right.
Yeah. And it probably didn't exist and probably...
Yeah, we're not going to find a bill of sale. I mean, it would be a miracle if we did. that we found a bill of sale for Joseph being sold into slavery. But we do see that there is evidence for, slavery existed, and we know from the price listed in the Bible was about the right price for a slave at that time. And then inflation was a factor. Before that it was different, lower. After that it was higher. But that fluctuated through history, and about the time that Joseph was sold, the price was that amount. Now there's another issue as well, because when I say about the time, right, there's a big dispute as to what that time was. And this is another issue that comes into play. And so, for example, with the Exodus, you've probably seen the movie, The Ten Commandments, right? And the Pharaoh and all this, That Pharaoh ruled roughly about 1290. And a large group of scholars place the Exodus at about 1290 BC. But there's problems with that. Because when we go to 1290 BC, what do we know about Pharaoh? Well, Moses murdered a man and then had to flee, right? And he fled for how long? About 40 years. And why was he gone for so long? What did he went away for? The Pharaoh to die and a new Pharaoh to come in. Right? Well, the Pharaoh before Ramses was Seti, and Seti didn't rule that long. So then, is there any indication that Ramses' son didn't take the throne? Actually, Ramses' son did take the throne. That's kind of a problem, isn't it? Because what happened to the firstborn son? Yeah. So, is this a problem? Yeah, it is. On the other hand, not all scholars, some scholars believe 1290, other scholars believe an earlier date. They believe the date of 1440. And a pharaoh called Amenhotep IV. Excuse me, Amenhotep III. I know that was a major change there. Okay. Well, we look at Amenhotep III, how about his father? Yeah, the father ruled a very long time. Definitely long enough. What about his son? We know Amenhotep IV came after him, but we don't exactly have the right biblical records. Right, excuse me, the right, we don't have the birth certificates. But they did find something called a dream stele, which is, basically it was a stele of these like obelisks they would write on them. And this was called the dream stele because Amenhotep IV put it up to commemorate a dream where he prayed that if he would be allowed to become the pharaoh, he would clean away the snakes. It would be covered with sand. And he did. Now think about that for a second. If you're the firstborn son, do you need that type of help to become pharaoh? No, you're right slotted in line. You're going to be there. So it would seem that something happened to the firstborn son of Amenhotep III. Don't know what. Well, there's one source that gives you an idea, called Exodus, but something seems to have happened to the firstborn son in allowing Amenhotep. Even more interesting is the pharaoh that followed Amenhotep IV, is also known as Akhenaten. Anyone remember the history of what Akhenaten did? He tried to reform the Egyptian religion and form it after one god, the sun god. Where do you get that idea from? So, if we're looking at 1290, things don't quite match up very well. If you're looking at 1440, things actually do line up pretty darn well. Now, most of the critics of the Bible tend to pick the 1290 day. And when they start arguing that, well, you point out, well, the evidence doesn't line up very well, they don't really care because they don't think it's all that historical anyway. So for them, this is just more examples of the errors, and another reason the Bible can't really be trusted. But if you pick 1440, can you say it's proved? No. But it sure lines up a lot better.
So the Egyptians did not write about the plagues?
No, the Egyptians are notorious for not writing about negative stuff about themselves. If you read them, it's like I listened to a Washington, politician talk about their faults.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very, very short speech. Or if it isn't a short speech, it very rapidly gets onto the faults of their opponent. From their point of view, nothing bad ever happened. Everything is wonderful under their reign. If there were any problems, it was obviously, well, there just weren't any problems. That's kind of the Egyptian view of history. So if there was something they didn't like, they would literally go back and they would erase it off the obelisks. So there was a ruler that they took over from, they didn't like that previous ruler, they would go obliterate that ruler's name from the obelisks. So they had no compulsion about modifying the history to make themselves look good. Given that framework, what would we expect to find in the Egyptian records about the Exodus? Nothing. So, that we find nothing about the Exodus is not really all that surprising. That's just the way the Egyptians were in recording their history. They would immediately sweep it under the carpet and pretend it never happened. Of course, it never did happen because no one will ever talk about it again, and we'll continue on our merry way.
Did the Egyptians use other slaves at the time, or was it only Israel? Because I would think then you'd see a halt in their construction for a period before they restocked in slaves.
That I just really don't know. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they used other slaves. Probably not an aberration. But don't really know.
You got a timeline in my Bible, and they put the Exodus at 1450.
Yeah. Yeah, most conservative scholars tend to put it at 1450. Most liberal scholars will put it around 1290. If it happened at all. Right? So when you're listening to the History Channel or something and they're doing a special and you hear these scholars talk about how the Exodus, and it really doesn't line up with the external history, almost certainly they're doing a 1290 date. But see, if you're listening to these people and you don't know that there's two different suggested dates, and by the way, if you do this for the Exodus, guess what? You end up doing the same thing for when Abraham lived. And for all these other things. And there's some questions we don't know. For example, we know that there's this phrase in there that says, Joseph was the ruler, and then the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, right? Well, we do know that Egypt was invaded, and that for a span of time, external rulers ruled. And that they were the pharaohs who knew not Joseph. And then they were overthrown, and the Egyptians took back over, and then that's when you get Amenhotep II, or Amenhotep III, and Amenhotep IV. But we're not sure exactly, was Joseph under the old pharaohs, and then the other group came in, and they were the pharaohs who knew not Joseph? Or was it that the other pharaohs came in, promoted Joseph, then the Egyptians took back, kicked them out, took back Egypt, and they were the pharaohs who knew not Joseph? We're not quite sure on that one. So we're getting back into a kind of a hazy period where we don't know a lot. And we're sort of picking out little pieces and trying to line things up. This also goes into effect for the conquest. And guess what? Not a lot of information and not a indication that there was a conquest in 1250. The Exodus occurred in 1290, then the conquest of Joshua should occur in 1250. On the other hand, by golly, there's some considerable evidence for a conquest right about 1400. Another problem for the 12, possible problem at least, for the 1290, 1250 dates is that 1229, archaeologists know that now there was another stele that was set up to commemorate something or another. And as it's listing through the nations, it lists the nation of Israel. So we know the nation of Israel was there in 1229. And if you read the conquest, and you read, that would be in the middle of the period of the judges and things were, you know, just doesn't seem like from 50 to 29, you're only talking 21 years there. That seems awful quick for them to have finished the conquest and formed up to be considered a nation, or at least a separate peoples. 1440, 1400, those two dates, that's plenty of time. And so that stele presents no problems at all for the earlier date. In fact, it seems to confirm the earlier date. Although you can't say, well, maybe, 21 years was enough time. Well, it strikes us awful quick. Probably the best way to think about archaeology is, you ever put together a puzzle? You ever put together a puzzle without looking at the cover? Try that sometime. Right? Pick a small one. Have all the pieces laid out. Don't look at the cover of the box. Right? And then try to put it together. But you can kind of think about it. You probably figure out, you don't know what this picture is. You begin to put things together and you see this little teeny piece. And you say, well, wow, that looks like it fits with this piece. In fact, you probably have seen this when you've seen the puzzle picture. You go, wow, that goes with this. And that makes a coherent picture. And then as you get more and more and more pieces, suddenly you realize, wait a minute, those two don't actually go together at all. They're actually from different parts of the puzzle. Right? And as the picture begins to take shape, you oftentimes will find that it's not exactly what you thought it was. Well, that's pretty much what archaeology is. We don't get an archaeology textbook. We get lots of puzzle pieces. And we try to take these pieces and we put them together and we try to make images. Over the years, we found a lot of puzzle pieces. We get together a fairly good piece. Things begin to line up quite nicely. But try to take that fragmentary puzzle and now overlay the narrative of the Bible and say, does this prove that, or confirm that, or demonstrate that? Or does this conflict with that? You can see it's hard to get a really exact answer. You go to the dates and say, well, yeah, this seems to fit about 1440. But does it seem to fit the same as, yep, it does? Not quite. On the other hand, there are a couple of things we can look at. We can look at the broad context, right? And sometimes, and this is important, but it gets overlooked because we take it for granted. We read in the Bible that there's a city called Jerusalem. Is there a city called Jerusalem? Was there a nation of Egypt? Were there Assyrians and Babylonians? Yeah. In fact, that all kind of lines up pretty much to exactly what we know from history. And in fact, it lines up so well that we oftentimes don't even, this isn't even considered. But it is evidence that the Bible is correct. And to give you an example, is take the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon describes the ancient histories of the Americas. It describes peoples. It describes cities. It describes land masses. It describes great wars and events. It describes people. So when we look at the Bible, we can place individuals, we can place events, we can place nations, right? Cities, all this, and it matches up. When we go to the Book of Mormon, there's not a single person, place, event, or land other than the Americas as a whole that we can say, yep, we know where that is. We can't say that there was a great war. In fact, actually, the more we find out about the ancient Americas, the less the Book of Mormon fits into the Americas. So, for example, when I actually did look into the church, Mormon church, back in the 70s, and when I looked in the 70s, I was told repeatedly that one of the quote, archaeological proofs for the Book of Mormon is that there's a passage in the Book of Mormon that says your people will extend from to the north, to the south, from the east to the west, the ocean to the east, the ocean to the west, right? And they cited as quote proof that there were the Eskimos up at the top, there was a particular tribe down at the very tip of South America, and obviously from both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. And this was a demonstration that the Book of Mormon was correct. Except that now we know that from blood work and DNA analysis and stuff that these are separate people groups and that they didn't come over and they're not Jewish bloodlines. So the blood group types don't match up. And as a result, the Book of Mormon area, so to speak, has collapsed down to basically the last time I looked at it, they were arguing for maybe the Yucatan Peninsula. Because that kind of juts out and up a bit. And you go, well, there's a north and there's a south, and there's an east and there's a west oceans. So that will fill the Yucatan Peninsula. Except that it really doesn't even fit what we know about the Yucatan Peninsula. Because there were people groups like the Aztecs, the Mayans, and all those other groups. The other big thing they were talking about is like, if only we could read the ancient Mayan texts. Because this would show that Joseph Smith was correct. We can only read those texts. Well, that sounded really good back in the 1970s when we couldn't read the text. Towards the end of the last century, they finally broke the code and they can now read Mayan. Guess what? Nothing even close to the Book of Mormon. So that's, actually it's one of my hopes is that Mormons, over a general rule, are very intelligent people. Very high percentage are college educated. So they're not like, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses tend to cut themselves off from education, and they basically only read the Watchtower and they insulate themselves from conflicting points of view. Mormons don't. Mormons are out there. They're engaged. And I'm hoping that this will sort of sink in the same way it did with the writings of Ellen G. White, and that eventually there'll be, God will make a reformation in the Mormon church. And will bring that church into the fold of Christians. And I don't think that's at all impossible. I think God can do that. But coming back to this, if you compare the archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon, which is 0, and you come over here and you compare the archaeological evidence for the Bible, where it fits so well into what we know that we don't even question a lot of it. Right? Of course there's a Jerusalem, of course there was a Bethlehem, of course there was Egypt. In fact, the depiction of Egypt in the Bible corresponds very closely to the depiction to what we know about Egypt. So there's a lot to believe that this is true. There's some other things. And we already talked about one of them, the slavery contract for Joseph. But those details about slavery do fit in very well with what we know about slavery. But there's another one. Take a look at Genesis 19:9. Genesis 19:9. It's always nice to quote from Genesis because everybody can find Genesis. Okay. Get out of my way, they replied, and they said, this fellow came here as an alien, and now we want to play the judge. We will treat you worse than them. They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. And of course, you all caught the significance.
I did.
Yeah, they didn't have doors at the time. Remember we talked about the JDPE, the documentary hypothesis, and that this was written much later. They didn't have doors at that time. They tended to cover, you go to first century Israel, they tended to just put a curtain or something over the door, a cloth. Right? But at the time of Lot, back at the time of the Patriots, they did not have a strong governmental structure. And people did have strong doors to protect themselves. Now, how did the writer, writing hundreds of years later at a time where strong doors were not common, know to write about a strong door? Why didn't he write about how Lot barred the curtain? This is important because these little trivial details are the most likely things to be overlooked if you're making up a story. Particularly since, we live in the modern world where if we go to watch a movie, for example, you saw this, maybe some of you, I know some of you saw that series on the Bible on the History Channel, right? Were they all wearing modern clothes and driving around in cars? Do they look like they lived in the 21st century? No, we expect a level of historical accuracy. If you go look at medieval paintings, for example, on Joseph and Mary, or they're all dressed in medieval dress because they did not have the same level of historical accuracy. You're going back even further, and you're having someone write about an account 1,000 years before they lived, where the details and the living structure and the social customs are vastly different. Right? How would they get those details correct? Let's get back a couple of more chapters to Genesis 16. A very perplexing passage for many. Verse 1 and 2. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. And so she said to Abraham, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. That's pretty common 21st century attitudes, right? No? No, it's not, is it? In fact, it's kind of puzzling. What in the world was she thinking? That was puzzling to a lot of people. The archaeologists began digging up marriage contract. Now, they did not find her marriage contract. But they found some marriage contracts from the period, and the right of succession and the need to carry on, quote, the bloodline was so important that clauses such as this were actually written into the marriage contracts. That within a certain period of time, if the wife did not produce an heir, it was her responsibility to find another woman so that an heir could be produced. So, in many respects, Sarah is just carrying out the normal practice of her day. Now again, if you were making up the story of Abraham and Sarah, you just wanted to write about it out of whole cloth, would you have come up with this? Would you have been able to think of would this be something that would come to your mind? If someone was writing several hundred years after this event where the customs and times had changed, and that was no longer the fashion, which it wasn't, how would they have come up with this? And yet, we know from marriage contracts at the time, that was written into the marriage contracts at the time. So why it doesn't seem to make sense to us, it actually does fit in perfectly with what we know from that period. And again, this is why little bits like this are so important, because it's really hard to conceive of how this got added unless the person was trying to be accurate and had some knowledge of what actually occurred. Now, so far we've looked at stuff that always lines up. There are a couple of things that don't. One of them is boy, did my mind just go blank. Okay, first the Jericho. There you go. The assault on Jericho, the destruction of Jericho. Right. That's oftentimes cited because at the time that the Israelites and Joshua were coming through, there doesn't seem to have been an attack on Jericho. Now, how do we explain that? I've already given you the answer earlier in the course. Because the people who make that claim argue for the 1290 date, and therefore the 1250 date. And no, Jericho doesn't seem to have been attacked in 1250. There is some indication it was attacked in 1440. Probably the biggest problem is the city of Ai. Right? Capital A, small I, pronounced Ai. And that's the city where, in the accounts, the Israelites go off on their own. They don't follow procedure. A group of them, well, we can take this town. Let's just go take it. They go off and they get beat. And then Joshua has to bring it back. And they go back the second day. And then they destroy the city. Okay. That one also doesn't seem to line up. In fact, when we go to the site of Ai in Hebrew means desolation or destruction. And best archaeological evidence we have says that that was destroyed well before even the 1440 date, and at the time of both the 1440 date and the 1250 date, 1400 date and the 1250 date, which would be the times of the conquest, was it lying in ruins. So it does not at all match what is in the text. I think the solution there is that what we have identified as Ai, think about it, that name means destruction. how many places could that name possibly apply to if all you're doing is a description? Now, could you describe how many places in ancient Israel as destroyed? Quite a few. And when you look at some of the other descriptions in the text, talking about how the land rises up and geological formations in the area, doesn't seem to line up with that particular city. So I think even though it seems to conflict, I mean, we take that piece of the puzzle from archaeology and you try to put it into our description of the Bible, it does not line up. We don't know what to do with this piece. I think the answer is because what we think this piece is referring to, this is not the right piece. It belongs to a different puzzle. Somehow got mixed up and no longer fits in this puzzle. And that the actual IE that's described is still out there to be discovered. Which, if you've gone to Israel, they'll probably have talked about, every hill out there tends to have a city under it someplace.
They found tells.
Yeah, every tell. And there are a lot of tells. And so they just have not found the tell that is the IE. I would argue that this is one of those places where we haven't found those pieces yet. Bottom line, lines up fairly well. In fact, when you start looking at things, little details that they're not earth-shaking, but like Lot's door and the marriage contract for Sarah, that lines up incredibly. I mean, actually, not only lines up, it helps us explain what's actually going on, particularly the marriage contract with Sarai. You look at the bigger picture, yeah, there's an Egypt, there's an Assyria. Recently, for example, David was believed to be a mythical figure until they found another stele, about 10 years ago, which goes to argue that this stuff is still continuing to be found with David's name on it. So we now actually have external confirmation outside of the Bible that there was a ruler of Israel named David. Now think about that in terms of what we're missing. How much information just got lost in history or remains to be found. One of the most important kings in all of Israel, and we didn't have external confirmation that he even existed until within the last 10 to 20 years. Probably the last 10 years. From that point of view, I think we're in pretty solid footing. The Bible is reliable. When we read the history of the Bible, we can be confident that this is what happened. Next week, we'll go into another section, which is science in general. We talk about archaeology. Now we'll talk a little bit more about science. And how does science fit in with the Bible, particularly in the 21st century? We'll get to miracles too. That comes even further. Again, we're going to talk about how do you begin, because I think a lot of people go wrong right off the bat by how they even approach and ask the questions. Right? And how do you think about science, and how do you think about the Bible, and how do you think about where those intersect? And so we'll start there next week. And if we get far enough, we'll even get into the whole issue of Genesis chapter 1. Which we didn't get to the handouts today, so there'll be handouts next week. Any questions before we quit? Yeah?